Hi, welcome to Brass Check, and we've got a very interesting and important guest today, Rick Sterling. Welcome, Rick.
Yeah. Hi, Ken.
And I actually think this may seem grandiose, but I think this is maybe one of the most important interviews I've done in ever, and certainly in a long time. And here's the reason for that. Um, he who controls history controls the world. And that is not a theory, and it's certainly not a conspiracy theory. It is literal truth. It's as true as water boils at 212 degrees. And how is history controlled? Well, how do you control history? Number one, you erase the real history and you replace it with your own. And we're all busy doing whatever it is we do, and we kind of rely on the media and our schools to tell us reality. And if they've controlled those two realities and we're being told a false history, we will accept a false history until someone comes along and tells us otherwise. Um, I stumbled on this just a couple of weeks ago, this whole concept that we're going to get into with Rick when I saw that the Israelis had a plan to build a canal from the Red Sea all the way to the Mediterranean, conveniently through Gaza, and they were going to use 500, I believe is the right number, of mini atom bombs to help do the digging. And I saw that and I went, whoa, President Kennedy never would have gone for that. And then I looked at the date. He had already been killed by the time this proposal came out, but it came out relatively after, not that long after he was killed. And then I started doing more digging, and that's when I came up with Rick's article, which I want to tell everybody about right now. And we're going to discuss it in detail. It's at mintpressnews.com, and the headline is From Dallas to Gaza. The JFK assassination was good for Zionist Israel. Now, that might have been put on by the editor. It might not have been your title, but maybe it is. And we're going to talk about because so let me set the stage, and then we're going to get into it. If you were just born yesterday, you would assume that the United States was always gun-ho for Israel. Israel uber alles. And I'm using that phrase specifically. Anything Israel wants to do is fine, that every president was all for it, all in. It's an American tradition. Not quite. Maybe that's the place to start, Rick.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to be here, Ken, and I think it is important. We're all very aware of the disaster currently unfolding in Gaza, where 35,000 people at least have been killed so far, where another 65,000 or 70,000 have been injured, where the hospitals have been destroyed, where medical doctors and staff and ambulances and aid workers have been killed by the hundreds. It's just a total disaster happening, with the awareness of the world. I'm really happy to see the students at Columbia University, NYU, and around the country coming out, UC Berkeley. It's really it's so important that we all express our outrage at what's going on in whatever way we can. This disaster that we're seeing now doesn't have to have happened. We're going to have to do what we can to stop it right now, but the roots of it go back to the Kennedy assassination, and I'm going to go into why I say that. Um, I became aware of JFK's foreign policy after reading the book JFK and the Unspeakable: Why He Died and Why It Matters, and it was written by James Douglas. It came out about 12 years ago, I believe, and it documented how Kennedy's policy toward the third world, especially, but also toward the Soviet Union in the latter part of his term of office before he was assassinated, was dramatically different than anything that had gone on before or after. Douglas makes a very persuasive case that Kennedy would never have sent masses of troops to Vietnam. He provides convincing evidence that Kennedy's policy was totally different, that the overthrow of Sihanouk in Indonesia wouldn't have happened, that the
Mm-hmm.
assassinations in Africa and other countries wouldn't have happened. And so this was an important thing. And I was actually organizing a an event around the 60th anniversary of his assassination last November. And
Oh.
then I started reading some more, and I found some very interesting reports because some of the documentation, the JFK presidential documentation, has only been released in recent years. And there was the publication of the letters that were exchanged between the Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister, and Kennedy. And what was just astounding was it was really evident that below the diplomatic cover, there was an intense conflict going on, and Kennedy was more or less issuing an order to
Hmm.
get Ben Gurion to make the Dimona nuclear development plant available for inspection because Kennedy suspected that it was being developed not for peaceful purposes, which they claimed, for energy purposes, but to develop a nuclear bomb. And I mean, you almost have to read the letters. I do have links to the actual letters in my article and the sources, so that's worth looking at. And then I discovered there were many other aspects of the Kennedy policy that were dramatically different. And I can just tick them off right now, Ken, if you want, and then we can go into them in more depth. But
Please do. And,
yeah, but
do
Kennedy,
you mind do you mind a quick sidebar? If I want people to
sure.
understand something if they're not aware, because I wasn't aware until recently. I didn't put it together. After Kennedy died, there was a bloodbath in the third world, in
Mhm.
Indonesia. I don't, what is it? A million Chinese
Yes,
people
yes, yeah,
were, and it happened fast. It was a genocide.
yes,
And then there were a lot of assassinations of third world leaders.
of course.
So a lot
And
of bad.
yeah, the coups in Latin America all took place in the mid late 60s when after Kennedy was assassinated.
And I want to do one more sidebar too before we get to the main event. I noticed, and I was kind of aware of this, and I never understood it in context. Now I do, thanks to your article. Kennedy was a big advocate for decency in Algeria. In other words, not allowing the French to brutalize the Algerians, which was
Mhm.
kind of an amazing position for a congressman from Massachusetts in the 1950s to take, and yet it's on the record. So this was a man who cared deeply
Mhm.
about the developing world and the people who lived in it and America's relationship with them. So just wanted to give that sidebar. And then, of course, after he was eliminated, the gloves came off and it was all on mayhem and brutality ever since, really. So
Yeah.
I took you off the track. Let's get back on
Yeah,
track.
no, I think you were right on the track because that Kennedy's support of Algerian independence was really emblematic of the different approach that he wanted the U.S. to take. Of course, France was a NATO ally, and here was Kennedy as a congressman arguing strongly. In fact, he delivered a 7,000 word address to Congress talking about the importance of supporting Algerian independence. The days of colonialism were over. And after Algeria achieved independence, he invited the President Ben Bella to the White House and rolled out the red carpet
Mm.
on the lawn of with soldiers at the ready. It's an amazing a video to see him welcoming Ben Bella to the White House. Regarding Indonesia, that was an extremely important coup that took place there after Kennedy's assassination. Well, Sihanouk had, or Sukarno, I mean, had invited Kennedy to visit Indonesia, and Kennedy had accepted. And then, of course, he was assassinated. And then you had Sukarno being overthrown and removed from power, and the 1 million deaths, the death squads being unleashed. So
And I
that
have to,
was,
and we have to say it appears that the CIA, with the help of some anthropologists,
mhm.
gave them the names and addresses of who to kill.
Yeah, right. Well, the CIA was definitely involved in those and the coup and the military dictatorships and the coups in Brazil, and then of course in the 70s in Chile and beyond. But um, that was a sea change. So Kennedy's policy was very different, and then wasn't just regarding Asia. It was regarding Africa and the Middle East as well. He wanted to be friendly, and so one of the leaders of the non-aligned movement was Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, and Kennedy developed good relations with Nasser. He wanted to have friendly relations with both the Arab states as well as Israel. And that was one difference. He didn't show the kind of favoritism and bias that
Mhm.
we've seen ever since. Now, another policy that Kennedy implemented was he wanted the Zionists to follow the rules, and the he wanted them to be registered as foreign agents, which they were. They were collecting money, and they were instead of sending it to Israel, they were using it to lobby in the United States. And so the Department of Justice under Kennedy was demanding that the predecessor of AIPAC, the Zionists of America, and AIPAC was born, or the American Israel Public Affairs Council, AIPAC was actually born in early 1963, given birth by the Zionists. But in any case, the Kennedy administration was demanding that they should register as foreign agents. Another,
And sorry to interrupt, but just so gives people a context for that, if you are representing a foreign nation
yes,
in our country and spending money on it, you need to register. That's the law. You can't just willy-nilly be the agent of, Afghanistan or Bolivia or something.
right.
Everybody registers. But Israel somehow wanted an exemption to that, and apparently they've received it.
Well, they basically they just floated it. They stalled and stalled and stalled, and then after Kennedy was assassinated, the demand was dropped by the Department of Justice. And there again, you have to look at the when you look at the actual Department of Justice letters and memos and the response of the Zionists, it's pretty astounding. You kind of almost have to look at the original sources to see the intensity of the exchanges.
And of course,
Um,
when you're talking about the Department of Justice, you're talking about Robert Kennedy.
Exactly. It was under RFK. So what that would have meant was that if you're required to register as a foreign agent, you have to, number one, account for where all your money comes from, and you have to account for what your activities are.
Hmm.
And they did not want to expose that. And in fact, they said in one of the exchanges, and again, I recommend to people to who want to are curious about this more to look at some of the actual letters and exchanges, which are linked in my article. Um, what they the Zionists of America said that if they were required to register as foreign agents, they would lose ground to the American Council for Judaism. That the American Council for Judaism may overtake them. Now, of course, the Department of Justice said, "Well, that's an internal matter." But that just points to the fact that the American Council for Judaism was an anti-Zionist organization that was very that still exists. In fact, they republished my article. Um,
This is so important, and I would venture to say a significant percentage of Americans doesn't even know that there is a Jewish organization of long-standing
yes,
decades of history that is against Zionism. Um,
they were totally against Zionism, and they were against the Zionists of America and then AIPAC. and uh, so and they were very influential. And then, of course, later on they became less influential, and the Zionists really, I think, gained dominance in the American Jewish community after the 1967 war. I'll get into that a little bit more. But the point was that the JFK wanted the Zionists to follow the rules. They were acting as agents for a foreign country, so they should register.
And his
Um,
and his brother's Department of Justice was
yeah,
attempting to
exactly.
enforce that.
Exactly. The third point was that there was something after the state of Israel was created in 1948. Of course, the Nakba, the infamous Nakba, happened, called the catastrophe, where three-quarters of a million people, three-quarters of a million Palestinians were forced to leave their homeland, and they ended up in Syria and Lebanon and Jordan and in the Gaza Strip, and in the occupied territories in the West Bank. Um, and the United Nations, this was of much concern to the United Nations, and something called Resolution 194, called the Right of Return, was passed. Israel initially said they would support this, and of course they never did, and they never have to this day, 75 years later. But the United States and the Kennedy administration was supporting Resolution 194 and was leading the charge, leading the committee, which was trying to pressure Israel to abide by the Palestinian right of return. And of course, much to the objection of the Israeli Prime Minister Ben Gurion and other authorities. But at that time, the Zionism wasn't cemented in place in Israel. There were significant, prominent Jewish voices that they were in favor of immigration or emigration to Palestine, but they wanted to live and let live with the indigenous people. They wanted a binational state in effect. They didn't want a hardcore Zionist state, which was what Israel obviously became.
So they wanted a single state with democratically run,
Yeah, exactly.
without racist,
Exactly.
organizing.
Equality. And there were people like Albert Einstein and dozens of other prominent Jewish Americans wrote a letter to the New York Times denouncing Ben Gur or not Ben Gurion, but I'm blanking on the name of the other prime minister at the moment, but they wrote it condemning the attitude of the government of Israel and the terrorist-like actions of the leadership of some of the parties in Israel. Um, then so the the point is that there was a lot of disagreement, and that Zionism hadn't hardened into the form of activity that it became. The fourth really significant policy was that Kennedy was intent on stopping Israel, or preventing Israel from developing a nuclear weapon.
Hmm.
And the Dimona facility, Dimona is in the south of Israel, in the Negev Desert. A nuclear development plant was being developed there with France. They claimed that it was for peaceful purposes. Kennedy suspected that they might be planning to develop a nuclear bomb there, and so he was insisting that this needed to be inspected. Now, at the time, Kennedy was really pushing hard for a nuclear non-proliferation and nuclear agreement with the Soviet Union, and preventing any more countries from developing a nuclear weapon.
And he had the open air test ban.
Yeah,
He
exactly.
was an
Exactly.
activist on this.
That's right. And I mean, there's a famous speech at American University in June of 1963, where people can just look it up and listen to it. It's a 20 or 25-minute speech where they call that his peace speech, um, because he was outlining a different kind of a world where we weren't in conflict, where we had peaceful competition. There was no question that the United States was different than the Soviet Union, but he said that we can recognize that that the Soviet Union has many positive values and that we should compete peacefully. Um, so so and everything. So this was in June of 1963. This speech, the development of the nuclear of the plant at Dimona was going active at the end of 1963. We had the Justice Department demanding that the Zionists of America register, including AIPAC, register as agents. All of these things came to a head in 1963. And then, of course, Kennedy was assassinated on November 22 that year. LBJ became president, and I didn't realize beforehand what a dramatic change that meant in terms of policy. I did not know the extent of the change in policy regarding foreign policy. Uh, I think.
But we knew the Vietnam War got escalated, but this other issue, which
Mhm.
is huge, I didn't know about it. You're an informed person. You didn't know about it.
Mhm.
I they've done a very good job of hiding this and changing the narrative.
Yeah, you're exactly right. It's been very well covered up. And even yeah, I mean, I'm a little bit surprised that James Douglas didn't do more on that. Now, James Douglas is finishing up a new book, which is going to talk about the four assassinations of JFK, RFK, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X. And I expect that to be a blockbuster book because he does tremendous amount of research. And I know James Douglas, a friend of mine, is a friend of his, and he
Oh,
read my article and he liked it.
well,
So
good, good.
um,
I mean,
so
there's three other men, Robert Kennedy, and we already talked about his role in trying to keep
mhm,
the Zionist machine under control, frankly, within
mhm,
at least within the United States borders.
mhm,
Uh, and now you look at Martin Luther King, he did comment on Palestine, I believe.
mhm,
I heard a speech, but now with AI, you don't know if people are making things up, but it seemed very clear.
mhm,
And, Malcolm X had gone to Mecca and come back radicalized in one way and de-radicalized in another way. He was de-radicalized I think from his viewpoint that black and white Americans could never find peace together.
right,
And
right,
it appeared that when he got back, he was like, oh my God, I have a whole new vision of the world. And that
mhm,
vision was Muslim.
exactly.
So his elimination uh, was also very convenient.
Yeah, yeah. Right. There are all those assassinations. Then there's Olaf Palme, and there's the Secretary General of the United Nations as well. So, yeah, it was that decade was a period of incredibly important assassinations, and
There seems to have been a fusion of Cold War, warriorship with
mhm,
pro-Zionist, no matter what ship.
mhm,
Uh, and
mhm,
but the covers seem to be, hey, we're killing all these people because they're pro-communist. We're on Martin Luther King's tail because we think he's a communist.
mhm,
Uh, you know, and I think some of that attitude still persists. I think there's a lot of intersection between the Cold Warriors. In fact, what happened? The Soviet Union, came apart,
mhm,
and the system needed a new enemy.
mhm.
And without missing a beat, suddenly they were beating up all the Arab and Muslim nations.
Yeah,
And
right.
it's the same people.
Mhm,
I have to ask you this question. We always hear about the neocons.
Mhm.
And so the neocon this and neocon that, and everybody names them and calls them out, and no problem there. But
Mhm.
aren't they also highly pro-Zionist? Many of these neocons.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's always been well, for at least 30 years, there's been a very strong Zionist influence in the foreign policy, and there still is very much. And whether or not whether a person's Jewish or not, it's kind of irrelevant. Joe Biden says I'm a Zionist, so
Well, were you aware? Speaking, I know, right? Oh boy, um, that's our president for
yeah,
now, at least.
right,
Yeah,
right.
he might be our president again for another 4 years. I just I have to editorial. I can't even believe they ran him.
Don't say that, Ken. Don't.
I can't even believe they ran him in the first place. It was a joke, but that's we won't spend time on that. Though I have to say something. But going back to the other shocking Democratic president, Lyndon Johnson, I came across material that says that he had family members who were influential on him, who were ardent Christian Zionists. Does
Mhm.
that, have you ever come across that material?
I have. There's a book called The Unspoken Kennedy Truth that just came out last September, October, and I think it was rushed into publication to ahead of the November 60th anniversary of the JFK assassination. But there's a lot of information there about LBJ. He had he visited Auschwitz. He had a personal he had some family member who was Jewish, and that was probably an influence on him visiting Auschwitz. And his main fundraiser was a Jewish Zionist. So he there was a
Can I
lot
just,
of
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm going to editorialize here. I don't think, and I've talked to serious rabbis about this, you can't be
yeah.
Jewish and Zionist at the same time. Judaism requires following the minimum, follow the Ten Commandments. That's like the minimum.
You're right,
And the
right.
commandments are really clear. You don't covet, you don't steal, you don't kill. So if you're doing that repeatedly, I think you've
Mhm.
opted out of Judaism and now you're a
Yeah,
Zionist. So, but
yeah.
that's my opinion, and sorry to take you off track.
Right, yeah, but there are people who are ethnically Jewish who are Zionist, and after the 1967 war, a lot of the American Jewish community that had misgivings or were ambivalent about Israel suddenly became, very supportive of Israel. Um, everybody loves a winner, and Israel won big. They pulled a surprise attack on their Arab neighbors. They had the support of LBJ's White House administration. They had the support of the CIA. They had a lot of support. Another, just as a side note, um, uh, under uh, under Eisenhower and JFK, there was not military aid given to Israel. Um,
Extraordinary.
the aid was food aid and humanitarian supplies. Now, Kennedy uh, did initiate the transfer of some defensive missiles, but that was the very first military aid. Prior to that, it had all been humanitarian aid, and it was only subsequently that, of course, now there's whatever $3.3 billion every year that's guaranteed, that's military aid to Israel, and we've committed to always have enabling them to have military supremacy in the Middle East. So that was, that's another aspect of its change. But I think in terms of the influence of Israel, the 1967 war. I've written another article more recently called the "From the Six-Day War to the six from
Mm.
6-day victory to 6-month defeat or failure."
Hmm.
Contrasting, because in 6 days they demolished and humiliated their Arab opponents, whereas of course we can see the failure and the defeat and all the bloodshed that's going on now. Um, but at that time, it gave a tremendous boost to Israel, and and of course within that you had the tragedy of the USS Liberty. Now, probably a lot of your viewers would know about the USS Liberty, but for anyone who doesn't, just look it up. It's a pretty amazing, it's an almost unbelievable story, but it's true, and it shows the extent of Israeli chutzpah or what. It's hard to know what to call it, where they intentionally tried to sink a U.S. Communications ship, and then I believe they were going to blame it on Egypt, and
Mhm.
the goal was to cement the relationship between the U.S. and Israel against the Soviet Union and Egypt. But that's an astounding story of the extent of their influence even in at that time
And I don't
in
have the numbers.
1967.
I don't have the numbers at hand, but I believe they killed 70 plus
But yeah,
seamen
that's right. Yeah,
and
I think it
injured.
was.
And this wasn't one errant bomb. I mean, they strafed this thing.
Oh,
They
oh,
they they destroyed all the first they destroyed the communication tower. They were very
yes,
methodical. This went on over 40 minutes. And then they destroyed all the lifeboats.
yeah, yeah,
And then they
yeah,
came out with torpedo boats and tried to sink the boat.
yeah.
And I think they saved them is the the let's see, what was it? The ship was able, they were being jammed. The ship was being jammed, but I think
Yeah.
the jamming was somehow interfering in the attack.
Hmm.
And I don't know, I can't remember the technical
Yeah,
details, but they were able to get a message out saying we're under attack.
yeah.
As soon as that message got out, the
Hmm.
attack stopped. But
Hmm.
we should say this: the admiral in charge of that region called U.S. Fighter jets to come
Hmm.
and protect that boat.
Hmm.
And the Secretary of War or
Yeah.
Defense,
Hmm.
uh, McNamara, he was still around, um, pulled him back, and the admiral said, "Hey, wait a minute. I'm not pulling these planes back on your say so, sir.
Hmm.
You're going to have to get somebody higher up." And Johnson got on the phone and said, "I will not have my." Well, I don't know if he said that to the admiral, but he said it later. "I will not have my ally or our allies." Embarrassed. Well,
Yeah.
our allies were murdering our servicemen in cold blood. So if you,
Right.
most of our readers know this, our viewers know this,
Yeah.
but we
Right.
have,
Right.
and this happened in '67, and it happened under Lyndon Johnson.
Yes. Yes. That never would have happened
Oh,
under Kennedy.
oh my
Um,
God,
no,
never.
but the point is that there was a sea change with the assassination of Kennedy that has hugely affected the U.S. foreign policy. Um, and I mean, and of course, Vietnam. Kennedy had sent special forces there, and they were, and he had increased the number of special forces there, but James Douglas makes a very compelling argument that he never would have sent ground troops or ground forces because he knew that it was futile. He knew that the Vietnamese had the support and they had the identity and the willpower to withstand anything. And why did he know that? Because he went there in 1953
Hmm.
when the French had
Oh,
half a
really?
million troops in Vietnam and they were fighting the Vietnamese then. And Kennedy um, spent weeks in Vietnam, and he benefited a lot from talking with a State Department staffer who was living there and who said the French are never going to win. They can't win against this in this environment, no matter how many people they send. That had a big impact on Kennedy and made him aware that of the resilience of the population, where there's a will to gain your independence, to fight against a colonial power, a foreign invader, and that's why James Douglas argues very persuasively that just on that basis alone, Kennedy would never have crossed the step. And of course, he didn't cross the step with the Bay of Pigs. He refused to authorize U.S. aircraft to go and back up the CIA trained Cuban exiles who were
Mhm.
invading Cuba in 1960, 61.
So many directions to go here with this. And Kennedy also had firsthand combat experience in the Pacific,
Yes.
so he knew not a pleasant place to be conducting a war, especially a jungle war.
Exactly. His brother died in World War II. He was injured. He knew it's not our the presidents nowadays, they have no military experience, and the neocons have no military experience.
I know, and it's amazing is there's a whole industry to slur and slander the Kennedys. And here's a family that went to war. Their young men went to war. They lost one, another one, escaped with by the skin of his teeth.
Hmm.
They did their part, and then this whole cabal of chicken hawks
Hmm.
and their scribes, they can't say enough bad things about the Kennedy family. And
Hmm.
no family's perfect. Obviously you can find dirt on anybody.
Right.
Um,
Right.
but but it's terrible. It's I mean
Hmm.
it well, speaking of changing history, because that is, when you don't acknowledge the extreme patriotism of the Kennedy family,
Hmm.
who made the literal ultimate and these were rich. I mean, Joseph Kennedy was a rich guy. He could have
Hmm.
bought his sons out of the war, no problem. That
Hmm.
would have been the easiest thing in the world.
Hmm.
Um, and forget where I was going to go with this. But anyway, yeah, uh, a rewriting of history. Speaking of a rewrite, okay, this is where I wanted to go. Speaking of a rewriting of history, and I'm sorry I don't have the book, and I'm sorry I don't have the man's name, but I came across a video from a scholar who was talking about how John F. Kennedy was Israel's best friend, and he started the tr and Kennedy was not an enemy of Israel. And from what I understand, Kennedy's attitude was, look, there's a whole region there with many, many, many tens of millions of people, and
Hmm.
Israel's part of the puzzle, and they need to get along with it, and everybody needs to get along. But anyway, there's some guy who's out there saying, well, Kennedy set the standard for U.S.-Israel relations. Well, I wish he had. I wish we'd
Yeah.
kept with his attitude. Um, do you know about that fellow, that the book that I'm referring to?
I have not read the book, but I've seen references to it, and I think you're exactly right. It's part of the disinformation. Um, I think there's been a very concerted effort for ever since the Warren Commission came out to hide a lot of stuff and to disinformation is what it is. And I think Seymour Hersh wrote a kind of an attack book on Kennedy, and I think some of the stuff he admits was just flat out wrong. That he relied, Seymour Hersh has done a lot of
Oh,
fantastic
yeah.
work, of course. Um, but a lot of times he's relying on CIA or other intelligence operatives, and they can disinform just as well as they can inform. In that case, I think the book claims that Kennedy had a previous marriage, and there's a lot of other stuff about Kennedy's affairs and so forth, some of which is true, but some of which is really not true. And and I think there's a lot of disinformation around his politics as well. Um, and so
And
uh,
they've done such a good job. They apparently have induced amnesia in Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Um, and we,
mhm,
we don't need to go off on that too much, but it's
mhm,
so, and I know him. I've
mhm.
worked with him on the Fauci book, and I, I admired him for years and years. I know he's an intelligent man. I know he's a
Yeah,
principled man.
right,
Uh,
right,
and it's so mind-boggling to me that he's not aware of this history. And hopefully he's not aware of it. And hopefully somebody will make him aware of it. Uh,
right, right. Yeah.
Speaking of disinformation, we have is it Jesus or Jesus Angleton?
James Jesus Angleton.
Okay. Now my understanding is he had the unique position of being a mole for the Israeli government in the CIA, as
Hmm.
well as the CIA's liaison to the Warren Commission.
Hmm.
Do any of these two things ring true to you from based on what you know?
Oh yeah, yeah. I've just recently finished reading The Ghost, which is a good biography of James Angleton, and there are a lot of very significant and instructive details in there. Like now, Angleton was the head of CIA counterintelligence, and he was unaccountable to anyone. Um, he was at the top echelon of the CIA, in charge of all of the agents that they've got going in various places, and all of the the spies working in the Soviet bloc, or in other countries. And of course, he had James or Lee Harvey Oswald, of course, was in the military and then supposedly defected to the Soviet Union and then came back. James Douglas has tremendous amount of information about that, but the point is that the Oswald file and the control of Oswald was in the hands of James Angleton, and unlike other foreign agents and people who had defected, the file was not part of the department. It was under Angleton's strict personal control, which the other significant or another significant fact is that Angleton, despite having grown up or having lived part of his youth in Italy and having been a fan of Mussolini and Italian fascism, he became a staunch Zionist. He had tremendous hatred for the Soviet Union, and he developed at the same time he developed a great fondness for Israel and for Zionist Israel in particular.
Were you,
Um,
sorry to interrupt, but were you aware that there was a Zionist contingent in Italy during the fascist times, and they were actually close to
hmm,
Mussolini? Mussolini even admitted some of them to his naval academy.
no, I was not aware of that.
Yeah, let
Interesting.
me let me dig that up. Yeah, there was very, very, very. Who's the mastermind of revisionist Zionism? The famous name. I'm drawing a blank on
Oh,
it. The
uh,
big guy. Anyway, he was fluent in Italian.
oh,
He was
okay.
a linguist who was fluent in Italian.
Hmm.
So oh, good. We have some things we can share then.
Yeah,
I'll dig
yeah.
that up and send it to you.
Right, right. So Angleton, and there are a lot of other interesting connections. Of course, Angleton was very upset after Ellen Dulles was fired from the CIA by Kennedy, because of the failure of the Bay of Pigs and because of disagreement over policy. Angleton was upset about that. Angleton would have been very knowledgeable and also very upset about Kennedy's efforts to stop Israel from getting the nuclear bomb. In fact, Angleton was involved in, and the author of The Ghost goes into this. Angleton was indirectly involved in Israel acquiring the uranium that went into the processing at Dimona from a nuclear plant in Pennsylvania. Um, so Angleton was a Zionist. He was the CIA connection. He was in charge of CIA relations with the Mossad, the Israeli version of the
And
CIA.
that's above ground. That's not when I call him a mole, that's
Mhm.
maybe an interpretation, but he had an official
Oh,
capacity to interact with
no,
the Mossad.
yeah, it was well known that he was in charge of those relations. So there was a lot of let's put it this way, he had a big motive, being intensely anti-Soviet, being intensely in favor of the kinds of things that went on after Kennedy was assassinated in terms of whether you call it the coup and the bloodbath in Indonesia, the military dictatorships in Latin America, the breaking of relations with Nasser and Egypt, supporting Israel in their aggressive campaign against Egypt and Jordan and Syria. So Angleton was right in was he was the key person. I think he has to be considered the key suspect for being the manager or one of the managers of the assassination of JFK.
Was he also the CIA liaison to the Warren Commission? Is that correct, or is
Well,
that
no, uh, the he was, they Ellen Dulles was on the commission, so
right? Of
they,
course, yeah. Talk about the hen house, the chicken in the hen house. I mean, the
yes,
wolf, the fox in the hen house.
yes, exactly.
Well, I mean, here it is, 2024,
Hmm, hmm.
61 years later, and
Right.
again, you're an informed person. I'm semi-informed at least.
Yeah.
Uh, how large is the assassination scholarship community? It's vast. And yet,
Mhm.
you'd be hard pressed to find much conversation about this
Mhm. Yeah, yeah,
until now.
exactly. Uh, there's a good quote that I include in the article, which is that in 1960, JFK was running for president against Nixon, and he delivered a speech to the Zionists of America because he was trying to get their support and some of their campaign donations. So in the speech, he says various complimentary things about Israel and the Jewish community, but then he says, "I cannot believe that Israel will forever want to be a garrison state
Mhm.
surrounded by hatred and fear." And that is so true today because it is a garrison state surrounded by fear and hatred.
Yeah.
And that's what it became. It hardened into that, where it's unwilling to compromise. They've rejected all the claims of the Palestinian right of return, all of those hundreds of thousands of and now millions of refugees. And I've been to the Palestinian refugee camps
Mm.
in Lebanon. It's unbelievable. They're crowded in. Uh, you can't. They've only got one or two streets in a whole in a 1 square mile, and all the otherwise you have alleyways that only vehicles or like golf carts can go through. Little ATVs go through them. Uh, Intensely crowded under terrible conditions in Lebanon, where Palestinians who live in these camps cannot have access to higher education. They
Mm.
can't have access to higher level jobs. It's and talking to them, they still believe in the right of return, and they have
Well, I
they
mean,
haven't given that up.
the funny thing is the Israelis believe in it too for themselves. I mean,
Yeah, that is the
I
supreme
mean,
irony.
utter
Yeah,
madness. Anybody who declares they're Jewish can move to
yeah,
Israel, get a passport, and become an Israeli citizen.
yeah, yeah,
Whereas the people who have been displaced, I mean,
yeah.
and when we talk about right of return, there was a protest where people, I believe, were marching to the fences in was it in Gaza?
In 2018, yeah,
And they were murdered by snipers.
right. 200 were killed by snipers and thousands injured, and it was totally peaceful. So, a lot of people think the conflict began on October 7, 2023. No, it goes back 75 years, And there's been milestones on the way. It's just got worse and worse and worse. So it's tragic. The one bright spot, in my opinion, is the outpouring of youth that's supporting Palestinian rights, including young Jewish support and activities and activism, and demanding a change. I think this is, the just as the 1967 Six-Day War, it was called, um, built up the image of this mythology of
Mhm.
Israel. I think what's going on now, the genocide in Gaza is going to demolish permanently the false image of Israel and expose what Amnesty International, what B'Tselem, which is the preeminent Israeli Jewish organization, and Human Rights Watch even have said is Israeli apartheid. Um, so, things have to change. After the ceasefire takes place in Gaza, the root of the problem is still going to exist, and there has to be progress on that front as well.
Absolutely. And yeah, I mean the place has really gone off the rails badly. And
Yes.
there are many very entitled feeling people there.
hmm
Um,
hmm
just a little detail that most people probably are at least vaguely aware. The Israelis had already killed, I think, 350 people in the East Bank,
hmm
um, West Bank, sorry, the West Bank before October 7th in 2023.
hmm
I
Yeah.
mean, who on earth would put up with this?
Right.
Um, and it amazes me that there are so many so-called conservative Americans who think that
hmm
this is okay.
hmm
And some of them are cheerleading, still to this day, are cheerleading for it. Uh,
hmm
and then I think people on the liberal side are a little more aware, but the silence campaign, the
hmm
propaganda campaign, which was very strong, and they launched it at the same time they launched the military assaults on civilians in Gaza. If you
hmm
stick your head up, if you say anything that's not
hmm
complimentary of Israel, you're an anti-Semite and pro-genocide and pro-Hamas and all this.
hmm hmm
Um,
hmm
yeah. So, well, and I think a lot of this, some of it at least, comes from not knowing this history, this basic fundamental history of our nation. And I think, when Americans, I don't know how long it's going to take, start to see all the connections between John F. Kennedy's murder
hmm
and the fact that this benefited, it did, it's patently obvious. It benefited the Zionists, the aggressive Zionist
hmm
group.
hmm
Um, and that Kennedy was taking very clear, definitive stance, as was his brother.
Yeah.
They were a
Right.
team.
Right. There's
Um,
been very little change in foreign policy, whether it's Democrat or Republican, since then. It's just been one war after another since Vietnam.
well, tremendous amount of resources from our country started flowing to Israel under Johnson, and of course, a percentage of that comes back to pay off to
Right.
lobby and to bribe our congressmen
Yeah.
or blackmail them. Some of them, I think, have to be blackmailed. You ask them about the situation in Gaza, and they almost jump out of their skin. They're so terrified to even be on camera
Yeah.
discussing it in any way because they're so afraid of saying the wrong word.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. It's really sad. And they just passed it. How many was it 20 or 30 billion for Israel the other day?
And
Um,
of course, it goes without saying, but it needs to be said. If we tell them we're not sending them any more weapons,
mhm,
this thing stops today.
mhm. Yeah. Right. Right.
Well,
Yeah, they are very dependent on the U.S., but I think the core of support that Israel had in the U.S. is diminishing very fast, and I think it's I think it's past the tipping point. I don't think they're going to recover their the the standing that they have had previously. Too many people are seeing what's going on, and especially the youth is driving this, and they're not compromising. Just last well, on April 15 on tax day, the San Francisco Golden Gate Bridge and highways in the San Francisco area were shut down for hours by young people demanding a ceasefire and end to the Gaza genocide.
Well, an anecdote on the other side is my wife tolerates my work, not disinterested in it, but doesn't follow it closely, and really was not in had a didn't have an opinion one way on Israel Palestine. Just didn't know what didn't wasn't her thing. Well, she's got a very clear opinion now.
Hmm.
And she's my generation, obviously,
Right.
and there's an example of somebody who wasn't really that involved. I've been interested since the day I learned about all this in the 80s.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
but there's no question whose side she's on at this point. So we got the young people, and I think we have a silent
Hmm.
maybe hopefully majority of Americans growing, or at least a growing group of Americans that realizes this is besides being profoundly unfair, unkind, criminal. I mean, this is anti-American,
Hmm.
and it's really some people have made the point it's anti-Semitic.
Hmm.
When you put a mask on and claim you're the Jewish state and then go out and commit atrocities 24/7,
Hmm.
you are creating by it, only you're going to create a backlash. There's
Hmm.
no way
Right.
around it.
Well, the
Um,
Palestinians are Semitic people, so
I know. And I have to say this, I don't hear anti-Semitic things of any nature coming out of any Palestinian. And I'm
no.
sure there are some that given what they've been put through, they might be addled. But they're very focused on Zionism and the
Hmm.
Zionist state. Uh,
Right.
and I
Right.
find them to be, maybe you found this too. I'm experiencing them at a distance. I know some Palestinian Americans, of course,
Hmm.
um, but they're so dignified and stoic
Hmm.
in the face of this. And
Yes.
I don't see them getting caught up in anger and the desire for retaliation. Now, if the Zionists have killed somebody's entire family, well, that's going to no, all bets are off at that point, and it would be off for me too, frankly.
Yeah.
But I don't see,
Hmm.
demonstrations of anti-Semitism coming
No.
from Palestinian people.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's really sad. It's the Israeli population that is infused with hatred and bloodlust and the desire for revenge over their victims on October 7. And I mean, I think Glenn Greenwald was estimating, I think it's more or less accurate, that there was about 400, not 1,200. About half of the civilians killed on October 7 were killed by the Israeli military. They had
Yeah.
Apache attack helicopters mowing down all the cars that were fleeing, leaving hundreds of vehicles totally destroyed. They weren't destroyed by Hamas. They were destroyed by the Israeli military.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
tactically, you can't light up that many cars with small
but
weapons. It's not going to,
exactly,
yeah.
exactly, and yet the hatred, the amount of hatred that's spewing forth from the Israeli majority of the Israeli population, and I mean, I don't know whether it's 10% or 20%. I hope it's more than that. There is a real core of Israelis who want peace, and they
Mhm.
realize they can never have security by stomping on the necks of
Right.
the Palestinian people. And the population is about equal. There's a really noble and good segment of the Israeli population that I met and experienced myself and saw directly when I was in Israel and Palestine, and the some of the people who have written articles and books, Amira Haas and others, and even quotes on I-24 from Israeli people who are protesting. But it's really disappointing, and that apparently the binge and the amount of people who have been brainwashed there to really have infused in their selves the sense of superiority and supremacy and hatred of Palestinians. It's really sad. It has to change, but I think the world, Israel, like South Africa, is not going to change from within. It's going to take world pressure, and it's on us. Israel's had impunity for far too long. And that's what's led to where we are today. The impunity needs to end, the genocide needs to end, and the apartheid needs to end.
Absolutely. And to take this full circle, one of the things that's needed is an accurate history and a blowing away of all this different disinformation smoke. And
Yes.
that's what your article, which I want to remind everybody, do read this. It's
Hmm.
at mintpressnews.com. It's by Rick Sterling. The title is From Dallas to Gaza, the JFK assassination was good for Zionist Israel. Rick's writing can also be found at antiwar.com, one of my favorite sites
Hmm.
for many decades now, and LA Progressive and other places too. So Rick, thank you so much for writing this article and bringing all these pieces together and giving me somebody I could interview about it and have a conversation with. Um, and I want to encourage my viewers, this is one to share. Please really rack your brains. Think of all the possible people you can send it to. This information is so rare. And yet, I think once people hear it, it's going to spread like wildfire. And I think it's going to be a big help. It's
Hmm.
going to be a big help if people know the real history, knew what Kennedy was about, what he was trying to do, what the other side was about. And he ended up dead, and they ended up running wild. That's the history. You can't change, as was George Seldes used to say, even the gods can't change history. They
Yeah.
can smear it for a while, but they can't suppress it forever.
Yeah.
Rick, thank you so much, and a pleasure to meet you too.
Yeah. Yeah. Very nice to meet you, Ken. Let's be in contact in future.